years and is part of the community television tangible benefits provided by CableNet and its parent company Cogeco.
I saw all this fury and anger in his eyes. He yanked me up from the chair and started shaking me and punching me. He was so much bigger and stronger than me, there was just nothing that I could do. I remember in the hallway, he was smashing my head off of the wall so hard that the pictures were falling down onto the floor and smashing. Then he threw me into the kitchen chair and told me, "If you move, I'll kill you." And then he went into the drawer in the kitchen and he grabbed a knife, went into the living room and sat down. He turned to me and he glared at me and he said, "I mean it. If you move, I'll kill you." And for what seemed like forever, I sat there while he watched TV. I was too scared to even ask him if I could get up and go to the bathroom. And then finally, he turned the TV off, and my boyfriend went upstairs to bed like nothing had ever happened.
Heather moved out of her boyfriend's apartment after this abusive incident. That was 3 years ago, and Heather still has trouble trusting men. Most women who have been in abusive relationships suffer this same problem, that of trust. You may find what happened to Heather to sound unreal or exaggerated. Unfortunately, it is but one example of what is happening in Canada on a daily basis. Statistics show us that 1 in 8 women is currently being abused by her partner. In 1990, wife assault accounted for 62% of the women murdered in Canada. Today, a woman is more likely to be abused by her mate than to be injured in a car accident. My name is B.J. Lewis, and I invite you to join me as we take a look at what is happening in the Canadian family behind closed doors. Domestic violence has been hidden within the family for centuries because traditionally society has viewed it as a private matter. Today we recognize that it is a national problem that includes people of all races, religions, and income levels.
It's a very serious problem. The latest Canadian stats show that 1 out of 8 women are in abusive relationships. So that's over 1 million women in our country. Our local stats, run sort of on average with the Canadian stats. So that in 3 years we've housed over 290 women, at least as many children, over 300 children. And then in addition to that, we've seen almost 500 other women in terms of our drop-in service and our weekly support groups. So there's no reason to think that the Comox Valley is any worse or not as bad in terms of violence against women. We have the problem just like any urban area or any rural area does.
From all walks of life, all education levels, income levels, color, all kinds of women, from Aboriginal women to handicapped women to doctors' wives, dentists' wives, teachers. It could be anybody. It could be the woman that's sitting next to you in any kind of situation.
I remember working with a woman whose family was very well off, and she could actually access the money in the family. And she was beaten about 3 times every year for about 20 years. And she went to Club Med in Mexico after every beating. And and you know, recuperated, healed, came back with a gorgeous suntan, and nobody ever knew.
We often associate hospital emergency rooms with the results of violence, including the victims of family violence. We conjure up an image of an emergency room where the injured party comes to receive medical treatment, a place where the process of healing can begin. However, few of the victims of family violence actually end up here, because family violence comes in many forms and is not always evident to the human eye.
Abuse is not just battering. In fact, I would guess that battering is the least obvious one. Emotional battering, sexual abuse or sexual battering, psychological battering, if you include that in the definition of abuse, you can see that it happens to a lot more people than just people who beat up their wives. And I think for me, that's a central issue. We're not just looking at men that beat up women, we're looking at men that control women. And I think power and control is the issue more than the battering.
If I'm a perpetrator, for instance, I may threaten you with injury. I may try to force you into sexual activity that you have no desire to engage in. I may use damaging information about your family. I try in whatever way I can to screw up your mind, in a way, to threaten you into a position, to force you into a position where you're scared of me psychologically, even though I may not have physically done anything to you.
The most obvious form of abuse is physical assault. Slapping, punching, choking, kicking. These acts of violence leave marks on the human body, which we can all see. Doctors are trained to mend broken bodies. But what about the victims of emotional and psychological abuse? How do we heal damaged self-esteem, restore positive values and attitudes?
We work with a tremendous amount of women who are psychologically abused. For example, they're not allowed to take the car without asking permission. They don't have access to the family money without asking permission. They're not allowed to buy certain groceries. The man in the relationship basically has all the power and control about what's bought, and right down to groceries, you know, that she's never allowed to buy cookies or broccoli because he doesn't like broccoli, or, you know, various examples of real control issues where there isn't sharing around the decision-making process.
I think the cycle of abuse is something that doesn't sort of jump out at a woman and say, this is abuse, you know? I mean, I think that it happens quite often without her knowing. It sort of starts with some emotional abuse. You know, if you love me, you do this, and, you know, somebody wanting exclusive time with her, isolating her from her family, from her friend support group. And that's how it starts. And I don't know if all women are aware of that's how it starts. I think it can be quite insidious.
That emotional abuse is a way of controlling women, and some men can throw a glance across the room and that'll have the same impact in terms of controlling their partner as if they would have hit them. So, having said that, I think you could include a lot of men in that category.
The abuse started within the first 10 days we had spent together, which was almost like a honeymoon. It was just wonderful. We had just gotten to know each other. We had, you know, the relationship had begun. And we were alone in our house, in his house. I was visiting. And I wanted something from across the room. And I said, I looked at him and I said, could you hand me that over there? I don't even remember what it was. And he looked at, and this was the man that I was crazy about. He looked at me and said, "Fuck you, get it yourself." And no one had ever, ever spoken to me like that in my whole life. And I remember just being devastated by it and wondering, how can this man who says he loves me talk to me like that? I just asked him to hand me something. And I immediately shoved it down deep and didn't ever think about it again until just lately.
At first it starts off with just a slap or a good backhand across the face, whatever. And of course the reason being, you're so ruddy stupid. If you weren't so stupid, I wouldn't have to do this. And along with the physical abuse is a lot of verbal abuse. And I think, you know, your broken bones will heal, but that emotional abuse just keeps building and building.
Survivors of abuse frequently say that the emotional abuse is the most damaging. It's the most difficult from which to recover. These women feel alone, helpless, ashamed. These feelings lead to medical problems such as depression or low self-esteem. Some women turn to alcohol or drug abuse. Some women become suicidal due to the abuse that they have experienced. In fact, in a study of 225 female suicide attempts, 83% were by women who had been abused.
I would say, "Oh, it's garbage day. Can't forget the garbage." We had a really long driveway and had to put it out at the end of the driveway. And I'd say, "Oh, can't forget, it's garbage day. Gotta remember the trash. Let's not forget it." So I'd say, each week I'd say, "It's garbage day." And he would look at me and say, "Get in the bag." And I remember the first time he said it, I got upset. I got angry. I said, "That's not funny." The second time he said it, I got angry and got upset and started crying, and I said, "That really hurts my feelings, and it's not funny." And it went on and on and on, and he said, "You can't take a joke. It's just a joke." And I said, "It's not a joke to me." And it went on and on and on and on. And finally, I just stopped listening. And every week, without thinking, I said, "It's garbage day." And every week, he said, "Get in the bag."
And so they do convince you you are being beaten because you are so bloody stupid. You're just stupid. Everything you do is wrong. And now I know that certainly isn't the case. Women that are battered tend to go out of their way to make things perfect because they don't want to be hit again. They do everything they can to make things just 100% perfect.
I would much rather have him hit me than him use his words. Because some of the things that he can say to me push so deep and hurt me so much inside that it goes right to the soul of me.
Things did happen to me, things that have affected me for a lifetime now. There are things that, situations that occurred during my marriage, and the abuse that I suffered was emotional, that did as much damage, if not more, than somebody beating me up. And it really surprised me to recognize this. It didn't occur to me that if somebody didn't hit you, then, you know, you weren't damaged. You are damaged.
Children are the most innocent victims of family violence. During their formative years, children who are witness to or victims of abuse learn to cope with life in violent ways, and thus they're more prone to continue that cycle into their own adult years.
The last memory my son has of his dad is me holding my 3-year-old son and his dad strangling me and me going down.
I'm frightened for my kids because I've learned so much, and it's so hard not to pass it on. And I don't want to pass it on. This is generational. When I looked back, it's generational through his family, and it's generational through my family.
I think that a 2-year-old doesn't understand what's going on and doesn't feel and is very unaware is not true. I live with her nightmares. I live with her clinging to me. She has a real fear of me leaving her. She'll wake up at 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, Mommy! And she wants to know that I am going to be there for her. And she needs that consistency in her life. And I think that for her to grow up with any more inconsistencies, any more unstableness, she needs a really stable, safe environment. And I'm giving her that.
The closest we ever got to discussing why he was this way was when he was telling me about his childhood. And he was really physically abused by his dad. He was really beaten, and a lot of emotional abuse as well.
50 to 70,000 school-aged children in British Columbia have witnessed the abuse of their mothers. Witnessing the degradation of their mothers causes these children to feel frustrated, upset, confused, guilty. Children who are witnesses to violence suffer the same kind of adjustment problems and emotional traumas as those children who have been physically abused.
Oh, children who witness abuse, they really don't do very well at all. They become abusers themselves. They become victims themselves. You know, if you can imagine yourself having to go to school the next day after being awake most of the night, hearing screams and cries and yelling and seeing Mum with bruises all over. And when you've witnessed that the night before, you're really tired and sleepy, and then you have to go back to something again tonight, and you don't know what.
But the children may have witnessed it, seen it, assume from seeing it that it's okay. They may have been given mixed messages, as boys and girls are given when they're growing up, that boys don't hit girls. And yet, they may see their father hit their mother. So the words are secondary. The behavior, seeing the behavior, is primary.
We know that violence is a learned behavior. So whatever you witness and whatever you grow up with in your early years and that you think is normal, you go on through your life thinking that's normal unless it's challenged somewhere along the line and some intervention is made where you then get the picture that, no, other people are living in different ways, and this is really not okay what I'm seeing in my family, and there are other ways to live. But without that outside intervention or challenging that belief system, it becomes internalized at an incredibly early age.
These children may develop rigid views of the roles for men and women. The boys become more aggressive while the girls become withdrawn, develop low self-esteem and depression. Because children learn from their parents, these children are more likely to grow up to be batterers of those who are weaker than they or victims themselves.
We do find around here from women's stories is that when women do find themselves in an abusive relationship, if they have been victimized as children, they seem to find it much harder to leave the abusive relationship. It's a much longer, more difficult process, and they usually require more support.
The women's movement has brought about advances in the rights for women in North America with which we are all familiar. However, despite the fact that most Canadians agree that women and men should have equal opportunity and rights in the home and in the workplace, many families still operate on the male-biased role model. In this instance, the man has ultimate power over all the family members, and the woman is subordinate to him.
And I'd be walking around the house making the coffee or singing, and he'd say, "What the hell's wrong with you?" Or, "Wipe that smile off your face." Because if I was happy and he was not, the household was not in a right place.
Most of the time, you don't have any money. These men don't like you to work. Now, a lot of women do work and are still battered. But they really like to have control. And I didn't even have money to to take the bus to the doctor when I was 9 months pregnant, you know, and I had a 10.5-pound baby, and boy, I'll tell you, that was a long walk that summer to the doctor.
On the surface, this may seem that we're taking the male position to the extreme. But if this is the case, if you think it's an overstatement, then how do we explain a society which says one thing, equal rights for all, and then acts counter to this? We allow the media to stereotype males as aggressive, unemotional, and prone to use violence to get what they want, while women are portrayed as weak, needy, wanting a man's protection, and used for exploitation, sexually or otherwise. If women and men are equal, then why are men taught through word and example that power is critical, and that any sign of weakness, emotional, physical, is to be avoided at all costs, while women are encouraged to sacrifice themselves in a relationship, to relinquish power in a relationship, to devote themselves to husband and family, even if it means sacrificing their own desires and potential.
Men, whether they're physically abusive or not, have an interest in controlling women, you know, keeping women in the home, keeping women in the place. I mean, that's why still in this day and age, women make less money than men do. Women have less of an opportunity at education.
You know, we have a long, long history of women having to fight for their rights. And when I say that, I don't mean that our perception is then that men are bad. You know, it's the way that our society has evolved. And men have been in a privileged position for thousands of years, and fortunately a lot of them are now seeing the light, that this really doesn't work for them any more than it works for women or children or families, to have this big power differential in relationships. And so you can see the whole start of the men's movement, because they're not comfortable in their position.
Every day, this lack of balance between men and women is reinforced in the media, in magazine ads, on billboards. We even encounter it in the way we respond to each other in the supermarket, on the job, or at school.
In television programs, quite frequently there's violence involved in relationships, and that doesn't seem to disturb people, you know. Quite often we say it's okay for boys to learn how to defend themselves, and it's not appropriate for girls. Socialization starts very early, and what we need to teach children is other ways of resolving conflict.
I think that the message that's out there in society, in our advertising and our media and so on, is that in order to be a man and to be really masculine, you have to keep your woman in line. And so it's okay to boss her around and cuff her around if that's what you need to do.
When a man abuses his partner, he is trying to establish his position of authority. The violence is not simply an isolated act of temper or loss of control. Consciously or unconsciously, he is using his action, his violent action, to control his partner through fear.
I think they have a problem controlling their anger at all. You know, if you've got a school teacher that abuses his wife, or a truck driver that abuses his wife, a bus driver, a lawyer, anything, he certainly manages to control that in his work environment. He doesn't go punching his co-workers. He doesn't go smashing his co-workers' cherished possessions. So I don't believe in anger management or problem controlling anger. They certainly choose where and when and how that anger comes out.
They try to control things that are safe to control. You can't control your boss. You can't control things out in the street, although some men will try, but most of them will control things at home, like the children and their wives, because it's safe to control that.
The men need to learn, they need to have their ideas about power and control challenged, and about their stereotypes about women. It's not about controlling anger. In fact, I talked one time with a man who led support groups or therapy groups for men who batter. And he told me, you know, a lot of stories about how controlled the men were in their abuse. How one man actually, in order to terrify his wife, would punch the wall right next to her face, not actually hit her face, and put his fist right through the drywall. And he said, this facilitator of this group said that this man would do it in an area where it was easy for him to patch up the drywall after. So it was just that controlled.
Well, it didn't have to be anything in particular. I mean, the time that he almost killed me, he just burst in the middle of the night. It was about 3 in the morning, and he'd been out. He came in, and he just kicked me. He must have jumped up on the bed. I don't really remember, but he kicked me, and I was right out of bed, and then he was kicking me and beating me while I was down on the floor. Another time, when I was, about 8 months pregnant with my son, he came in with a couple of friends. I don't know what I said. I didn't think I said anything wrong. But next thing I knew, I had a fist right in the side of the head. And there again, he was kicking me when I was down. And I know now that at that point, the artery ruptured again. And I was really bleeding at that point. But the weight of the baby stopped it. You know, when I could stand up and start moving, then the weight of the baby pressed down on that uterine artery and stopped the bleeding. But boy, you never saw blood like that, I tell you. It was frightening.
Some men learn as children through trial and error that violence works as a power strategy. They may have seen their fathers abuse their mothers. Their first experience with assault teaches them that violence can lead to a quick win in an argument. It not only makes them the winner in the argument, but it also allows a physical release of all of the pent-up feelings. These results seem positive to the one who is assaulting. And so the violence continues. And not only does it continue, but it takes less and less to trigger the violence. To stop the abuse, a man must realize that he is solely responsible for his actions. His girlfriend or his wife did not make him do it. Most importantly, he has to understand that there is no excuse for abuse.
The abusive man is usually in major denial. He thinks that he has to hit her because she made a lousy supper. She spent money on something that she shouldn't have. She can't keep the kids quiet and she's a lousy mother. She's getting too fat. So he thinks that she's pushing him and, you know, like, you know if you do this or if you say this, I'll have to hit you. So why do you do it? So he's always putting the responsibility for his behavior onto the woman. So that's what we call major denial on his part. And one of the things that we as a community can do is put that onus back on him for his behavior. No, you're in charge of the violence. And no matter what she does or says, you know, the responsibility for the behavior lies with you.
He has a very strong urge to control everything in that home. Okay, so he needs to manage anything that's going on, and sometimes they don't really see it as being something that shouldn't happen. It's she pushed me, she did this, she did that. It's always some other reason why he did what he did, that there's no responsibility for him.
You may wonder why a woman stays in an abusive relationship. It most certainly is not because she likes being abused. Each woman has her own reasons for staying. Some are financially dependent. Many want to think that things are going to get better. They survive on hope. And all are under pressure to preserve the family unit. Some women will try to minimize the seriousness of the abuse and even want to protect her partner.
But there seemed like there was always two sides. If there wasn't another side, I don't think that I would have stayed with him. There was always the loving, the trying to be nurturing person inside there too. Always that part of him that made me cling and try and bring that part out of him. And then he'd go into a mood swing for a week or two and be just a real, I don't know if you could say asshole. He was just very irritable.
I tried so hard to respect him and to find things that made the relationship work. I didn't understand it. I discounted his behavior.
At first it would just be a slap in the face, and then it was using fists. And there were times when I didn't even look like a person. I was so badly beaten. My face was so swollen and black, my eyes wouldn't be open for a couple days. I'd be bruised right down into my throat and chest area, not to mention arms and legs and whatever. But it did get to a point where he beat me so badly. I had a ruptured artery, and I spent 6 weeks in the hospital with that one. And it wasn't just due to the ruptured artery, but I got very sick. They never could find out why. It was probably psychosomatic. I suppose I just didn't want to go home. But I developed an extremely high fever and was really ill for, oh man, I was out of it for 2 weeks, I think. And anyway, during that time, I had a lot of time to lie there and think about this. And I knew all the blood that was all over the bedroom. And my kids getting up in the morning and seeing that. And I thought, you know, I was so close to death that time that I knew if I stayed, my kids were going to grow up without me. And I didn't want them to see this happening, because I think children are what they learn. And if they're raised to see this, well, then that's all right. We'll do it to somebody too. And I didn't want that. So that's when I decided to get out of there.
I didn't want to end my marriage. I wanted to try and make it work. I came to a point where I realized that there was nothing that I could do anymore. He had to do it. But even for several months after I left him, I hoped that he would get into recovery and that there would be some sort of future for us sometime down the road. That didn't happen.
There's a lot of reasons why she stays. I think financial is a big one. Emotional dependency is probably another big one. I mean, these women love their husbands, just like most women love their husbands. And it's no different whether you're abused or not abused. Quite often they're isolated to the point where they don't know about resources. They don't have contact with family and friends. So, you know, that's another reason not to leave, because you don't know what's out there. And sometimes where you are is safer than to leave.
I think when a woman finds out, realizes that she's in a relationship that is abusive, it's really, really hard to name it as that, because there's so much shame and guilt and degradation around saying, I am a battered woman or I am an abused woman. So naming it, calling it, is really, really hard, I think, for all of us to put it out there. I think also that women put up with abuse as a survival mechanism. They're afraid. They've been told by their partner in a lot of cases that if you leave, I'll kill you, or I'll take the kids, or I'll kill myself, or I'll hurt, you know, some member of her family. So there's a real element of fear in keeping the woman in that relationship. And also there's the other major restraint is poverty. A lot of women, if they leave their male partner, are looking at maybe halving their income, their annual income, or even worse.
Abuse is a pattern of behavior, unfortunately, not one or two isolated incidents. The cycle of violence will continue, and regardless of what the man says, his level of violence will actually increase in intensity and severity. A woman cannot stop a man's violence or abuse. He must accept the responsibility for his own actions. When he understands that abuse is not acceptable behavior and wants to change his pattern of behavior, he can then seek help.
Working with abusive men, I mean, there's no cut and dried solution to it, you know. I mean, men batter for different reasons. I mean, overall they battle for power and control. But when you present men with the idea that, you know, do you want to be a manipulative, power-mongering offender, or do you want to be a man who would like to relate respectfully to a woman and relate sensitively to a woman, he's going to choose that. I have yet to see a man who will tell me verbally that he chooses to relate to a woman disrespectfully and abusively, right? So when you give them those kind of choices, they tend to pick the healthier choices. And in a treatment program, you can help men make those kind of choices and then act on those kind of choices.
Some that I've worked with are in their 60s. And it's something that's been occurring for them over a 60-year period, right? From birth till now, to become the people they are. And they aren't going to change overnight. It's going to take a long period of time.
Like, really, I don't care how angry you are, you know? I mean, anger's okay. It's what you do with the anger that's crucial, right? If you do it at the expense of other people, then it's dangerous, and society has a responsibility to protect people from those kind of individuals. But I know lots of men that get really angry, but don't beat up.
Assault, including wife assault, is a crime. The RCMP in British Columbia have the authority to lay criminal charges against anyone they have reason to believe is assaulting his wife or girlfriend. This means that it is not the sole responsibility of the victim to lay charges against an abusive boyfriend or husband. It is the duty of the police.
But he got violent that last time, shoving me and grabbing my arms and bruising my arms and threatening me with his fist right up this close to my face, the whole length of the living room, saying, "You want me to kill you, you want me to hurt you." And I kept saying, "No, no." And again, he called the police and said, "You better come before I do something." So, but the police here were different. They came and took him away and charged him with assaulting me, which was different. And I got out and I stayed in hiding. And I went to court and I testified against him.
We can only hope that when charges are laid against a man who is assaulting his wife, he will realize the severity of his actions. Recent studies indicate that charging does reduce the frequency of assaults, and in some instances actually stops the violence. The police do not have to become involved, however. There are many organizations within our communities who want to help. The telephone numbers for these organizations will be run after this program.
There are tremendous services here in the Valley, and I think probably I'd go to Transition Society even before I'd phone the police, because the emotional support and the physical support are indispensable. You're not thinking clearly when you're in a crisis situation.
My best advice would probably be to just try and gather all the inner strength you can and get out, because they don't change. They don't. It just gets worse. And that kind of a man is always going to do it. And he's got a lot of problems, and you can't solve them. You know, you can try. You know how people think, well, if I marry this guy, I might not like this or I might not like that, but I can change it. Take a look at why you like them. If you want to change them, you don't really want them. So look before you leap. I didn't.
Dig deep and look for the strength to pick up the phone, because there are women out there that have been through what they're going through, and even if they don't want to leave, just talk to somebody and try and reach out. And I know that it's very hard, but it's very important, and that it doesn't have to get to a crisis situation for you to reach out.
I would say you don't have to live like that. There are other options. And there are agencies and people that can help you look at your other options and make that transition. It's a very unhealthy lifestyle for you, and it's extremely unhealthy for children. And I just say, talk to people and try and get away.
The prevention of domestic violence is a responsibility that we all share. To put a stop to family abuse requires some changes. Most importantly, if you are aware of a woman or child who is being abused, call the RCMP and report it. In addition, society must begin to model the positive views it says it holds regarding equality between the sexes. There is no room for violence in a relationship of equality and respect.
I think society has in the past had a high tolerance for abuse. Not in an obvious way, in a very subtle way, right? The laws haven't been very harsh on male batterers. You know, if you assaulted someone in the street, you'd get a heavier penalty than if you assaulted your wife. I mean, that's changing. But the idea of men controlling women, I don't know if that's changing very much, because that's not been the focal point. The focal point is the black eye. The focal point is, you know, those obvious things that really horrify us. But I think the issue is control, power and control, and society needs to wrestle with that one. I mean, if we're going to live in a society that's equal and fair, that means women have to have the same access to power and money that we do. And I think we're a long shot from that.
And it's going right back to square one and raising our kids to be well-rounded little people and not to be slotted into being little girls who wear pink and play with dolls, and little boys who are allowed to climb trees and get dirty and be aggressive and play with trucks, you know. And I get a sense that there's, you know, some movement being made in our society to, I guess, challenge those old traditional ways, which put, you know, straitjackets on all of us.
In addition, we must examine carefully the role of the family in maintaining social values and how best we can support and promote healthy family interactions if we truly believe that the family is the cornerstone of Canadian society. Finally, we have to start talking about family abuse to demonstrate that we will no longer accept violence against women and children. As long as we consider domestic violence as a family affair, the abuse will continue behind closed doors.
Myself, personally, what I can do is you know, try as hard as I can to live in a fair and equal relationship with my partner so that my daughter witnesses what a fair and equal relationship is all about, and my son witnesses what that is all about. And I suggest that if people want to do the most, that although that may not seem like a lot, if everybody focuses on equality in their relationship, we might have a better society 20, 30, 40 years from now.